Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream. There's probably one thing I should say right up front, because it's pretty notable. 2010's Alice in Wonderland was a massive, kind of unbelievably big hit. It made over $1 billion at the worldwide box office and is still in the top 50 highest grossing movies ever made. And watching it now, especially after a sequel that really fell flat on its face at the box office, it's hard for me to completely understand why. Of course, there's a few possibilities. One is that it was one of the first big blockbusters released after Avatar's 3D totally blew people away, and people thought they'd be getting a similar 3D experience. Which of course they didn't, because Avatar was made from the ground up for the format, while 3D was just kind of slapped onto Alice after the fact. It could be people's love and nostalgia for Alice in Wonderland itself, which I'm sure played a role. But I think more than anything, people just loved the idea of Tim Burton and Johnny Depp tackling this story. On paper, this was just about the perfect project for them. And then, well, the actual movie happened. So that's what I want to talk about this week. The movie that kind of finally made me give up on Tim Burton, and how its success took Disney into a new era. One that, for better or worse, we're all still living in.
Good morning, sound and taste.
Boy, it is fun.
Yeah, but don't tell Snow White. She'll bring those 7 little guys with her.
Like a lot of people out there, I really like Tim Burton. At his best, he brings a style and mood to his work that still feels unique. He seemed to emerge with that style fully formed too, with his early short Vincent, about a kid obsessed with Vincent Price, which is still one of my favorite things he's ever made. And that hot streak continued for a pretty long time. It saw the director bouncing from weird and interesting personal stories like Beetlejuice and Edward Scissorhands to great adaptations of beloved characters like Pee-wee's Big Adventure and his Batman films. Most of them were huge, and even the ones that didn't do that well at the box office, like Mars Attack, are now established as cult classics. And Johnny Depp was a pretty big part of that. He wasn't in all of Burton's movies, but he is a star of my favorite, Ed Wood. Burton's masterpiece, and the one that showed the possibilities of how he could continue to grow and mature as a filmmaker, which debatably never really happened. Okay, maybe that's not totally fair. He's made some solid stuff in the past 20 years, Sweeney Todd and Big Fish kind of being the highlights for me. But for the most part, it often feels like he's given up. After the disastrous Mark Wahlberg Planet of the Apes reboot, it kinda seemed like something changed. His movies, which were once consistently full of clever ideas and strange creative moments, started to feel a little more like a formula of applying that Burton look onto old properties without much passion. There was also the addition of a lot of CG to his films, which isn't always a bad thing obviously, but more and more he seemed to lean on it as a crutch, which really takes away from the handmade charm that can be found in things like Pee-wee and Beetlejuice. Those tendencies were very apparent in his Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but are kicked into overdrive in Alice in Wonderland. And look, I feel a little bad saying what I'm about to say, because I know a huge team of people poured countless hours into all the designs and CG in this movie, but I really think this is one of the single most unpleasant movies to look at ever made. And this is as someone who likes his aesthetic in a lot of other places, even recent stuff like Big Eyes or 2012's Frankenweenie. But this is just an eyesore. Taken completely on their own, I think some of the CG creations look pretty good, like the frogs in the Queen's Court, but then others, like the talking dog, just look really bad. And there's not much coherence to these designs either. So the end result kind of feels to me like one of those asset flipping games you'd find on Steam, where different things in the game were clearly made by different people who are going for different art styles. It's sad to see this from the guy who made Beetlejuice, one of the most visually interesting and well-designed films of that decade. For a film with Wonderland in the title, I don't think there's much wonder to be found here. So many of these locations just feel like someone talking in front of a green screen in a warehouse. And it didn't have to be that way. I mean, let's go back to the movie that kicked off the real 3D craze, Avatar. Is it a perfect film? No, but that world feels expansive, detailed, lived in, and wondrous. It feels like a real physical space. So it's not that I have a problem with CG being used extensively, it's a great tool. I just think it's used really badly here. Sure, it was made over 10 years ago, but it still doesn't hold a candle to the worlds created in Avatar or even Speed Racer, which was made a few years before this. But okay, even if the movie doesn't look great, that doesn't have to be the end of the world. After all, it's based on a book with some of the most fun, strange, and whimsical dialogue out there. That could be something the movie really excels at. Unfortunately, that's just not really where the film's interest lies. This Alice in Wonderland has a really weird relationship with both the Lewis Carroll book and the Disney animated film. For one thing, Burton has admitted to not really being a big fan of either of them, but also because it's sort of trying to function as a sequel to the cartoon. We at least see some flashbacks to childhood Alice, who is dressed like she is in that film. But it's also a really mishmashed retelling of the first two books, with a heavy sprinkling of Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky poem, which actually ends up forming the backbone of the narrative. I think that could have been interesting. I at least applaud the movie for not being a bland remake of the animated film, like The Lion King was. But that doesn't mean that the story here they're telling is great either. And this is where I start to echo some of my issues with the Narnia movies in a video that I made a few months ago. See, in this movie, Lewis Carroll's source material kind of has to bow down to the Hollywood blockbuster playbook, just like C.S. Lewis's did. Visually, it's a pretty weird movie, but narratively, it's about as conventional as they come. They use the Jabberwocky poem to shove a very traditional Hollywood story into Carroll's world. What that poem provides the movie is pretty simple: a monster to fight and a MacGuffin that serves as a plot point. It's very fantasy movie 101 stuff, complete with a big third act battle with two opposing armies meeting on the battlefield. Just like the prolonged battle in the first Narnia movie. It all just feels extremely calculated, in a way that Burton's best work isn't. This is an Alice in Wonderland story where everything about that world is squeezed into the shape of a very generic fantasy movie, and that's kind of the laziest option they could have gone with.
Behind this enchanted door is a rabbit who's late and a smiling cat, and on birthday party with a hatter who's mad. As you would think.
I should also touch on the performances though, and I will say they're not all bad. Alan Rickman is great as the Caterpillar, injecting that character with a sense of mystery and gravitas that his actual dialogue doesn't really deserve. And no matter what you think of Helena Bonham Carter's Red Queen, she is committing to this performance, and some of her jokes actually land too. Probably my pick for the lead actor who comes out looking the best from this whole mess. Our lead, Mia Wachowski, isn't terrible, but after the opening 15 minutes or so that are set in the real world, she just fails to make much of an impression. I don't really think that's her fault either, because for all of Tim Burton's talk about how he wanted to reinvent Alice to be a more proactive adult character, she barely gets anything interesting to do, being whisked around from location to location, and having the plot just kind of happen to her, not really making choices of her own until the very end when she decides to fight in the big battle. Johnny Depp's Mad Hatter is... okay, maybe this is a controversial opinion. I know this character sold a lot of Hot Topic merch and people were really into it, but this is a bad performance. Depp can of course be an incredible actor. He's great in Ed Wood. He carries Edward Scissorhands. And I think it's safe to say that without Jack Sparrow, that first Pirates movie would be remembered as a solidly fun little throwback, not the cultural phenomenon that it became. But I feel like this was the era of his career where he started letting the over-the-top costumes and exaggerated expressions do all the acting for him. There was one part of this movie where it really felt like Depp was actually acting with another person in the scene and playing off their performance well, when Alice and the Hatter are discussing the possibility that he might be a figment of her imagination. That was just a nice, simple little scene between two actors. But for the vast majority of this, he feels like he's in a one-man play. He showed up with a bag of tricks to play with, like going in and out of a Scottish accent that sounds like Mel Gibson in Braveheart, but Burton never really bothered to mold that into an actual character. Which is frustrating. All of Depp's weird acting choices can be put to good use, and Tim Burton has done that with him in the past. But in this, and their next film, Dark Shadows, it just feels like the pair think that Depp being wacky and wearing expensive costumes is enough. But without that strong emotional through line that characters like Edward Scissorhands had, that shtick kind of gets old. Lastly, there's the legacy of this movie, which is something I don't think Tim Burton really intended at all. When this became a smash hit, Disney started to take note of one thing. they could repurpose their old animated movies into new live-action films. Sure, they had done that in the 90s with 101 Dalmatians, but I think it was Alice in Wonderland that really took us into this modern era of no Disney animated film being left untouched. Burton seems on board with that. He directed Dumbo, which was one of the better remakes, but it's a trend that, as you might know, I'm not a big fan of. Alice in Wonderland itself seems a little forgotten now, receiving a sequel that flopped and not tons of discussion these days. But the spark it ignited, of Disney reaching into its animated back catalog in the hope of making a bunch of money with a new live-action film, seems like it'll be with us for a very long time. Oh, and if you're interested in hearing my take on another strange cinematic experiment, I have a video on Ang Lee's Hulk that you can watch right now on Nebula. That was a weird, fun movie to talk about, but it's just the tip of the iceberg of what Nebula has to offer. I have more videos on Rick and Morty and Cheers, alongside creators like H Bomber Guy, Patrick Willems, and Nando V Movies. Nebula continues to do its job of giving creators an alternative to YouTube and its algorithm. And of course, that's just half the package. When you sign up for Curiosity Stream, you'll get an email welcoming you to Nebula as well, both services in the same great bundle. Lately, I've been watching The History of Home, narrated by Ron Swanson himself, Nick Offerman, a documentary series that traces the history of the structures that we spend our lives in. Curiosity Stream also has documentaries on science, tech, nature, the list goes on. There's always something new to find on there. You can get all of that for $14.79 for an entire year. That's a 26% discount. So go to curiositystream.com/captainmidnight. That's curiositystream.com/captainmidnight.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.